The lights of the studio glimmered like a constellation, suspended just above the stage, each bulb a silent witness to the drama that was about to unfold. Keanu Reeves walked down the hallway with his usual unhurried grace, dressed in a simple black suit, his hands tucked loosely in his pockets. The television network had been preparing for this live broadcast for weeks, a special segment celebrating influential creative partnerships in the film and art world. It was supposed to be a peaceful, inspiring conversation. But beneath the surface, emotional currents had begun to stir. For months, whispers had circulated in the industry, quiet comments about Keanu's growing distance from Alexandra Grant. They had built an image together, a partnership that many thought would last. But the truth was more complicated. Alexandra had always carried herself with fierce independence, but lately she felt something shifting. Keanu's renewed connection with Sandra Bullock, innocent though it was, unsettled her. Old friends reconnecting after decades apart had stirred a storm of insecurities she hadn't expected. The public adored Sandra and Keanu together. Photos of their laughter during press interviews spread like wildfire. Comments flooded social media, most harmless, some not. "They're perfect together," one caption read. "Just get married already," another joked. Alexandra saw every word. She tried to brush it off, but the sting lingered. Backstage, Sandra stood near a makeup counter, dressed in a soft cream blouse that reflected the warm lights. She looked up as Keanu approached, her eyes lighting up with the kind of familiarity that time couldn't erase. "You ready?" she asked with a grin. "As ready as I can be," he replied, smiling faintly. There was something comforting about Sandra's presence, like stepping into a room that always smelled like home. They had been through wild rides together, blockbusters, heartbreaks, and the strange dance of fame. Their friendship had survived it all. What neither of them expected was that their closeness would soon become the center of a live broadcast storm. In another room, Alexandra adjusted her dark silver dress in front of a mirror. Her stylist's hands hovered nervously. She had insisted on joining the interview at the last moment, framing it as a creative couple's surprise. But deep down, she had another reason: to reclaim the space she felt slipping away. As she applied her lipstick, she rehearsed lines in her head, trying to maintain a poised tone. Yet her heart pounded like a drum in an empty hall. She told herself this was just about asserting presence, not confrontation. Still, a small part of her wanted to strike. When the show began, the host welcomed the audience with cheerful energy. "Tonight we have a truly special reunion," he said. "Two icons whose friendship defined an era of cinema, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock." The crowd erupted in applause as the two walked onto the stage together. Keanu offered Sandra his arm like an old-fashioned gentleman, and she took it playfully. Their shared laughter filled the studio, genuine and light, and for a moment the atmosphere was golden. But behind the camera, Alexandra's jaw tightened. The first segment went smoothly. They spoke about their early days, their shared experiences filming together, the struggles of rising through Hollywood. The audience leaned in, captivated not by gossip but by the warmth between them. Keanu's humility shone through in every answer. Sandra's wit brought the perfect balance. Then came the surprise guest moment. The host turned dramatically to the side stage. "But wait, someone else special has joined us tonight. Please welcome artist and visionary Alexandra Grant." The crowd clapped politely. Alexandra walked in gracefully, her heels clicking against the floor like punctuation marks. Keanu looked momentarily surprised, but masked it with his characteristic calm. Sandra turned toward her with a polite smile, sensing the shift in energy. At first, Alexandra played along, answering questions about her artistic projects and how creativity intertwined with personal life. But as the conversation shifted toward Keanu's career and his recent collaborations, the subtle tension in Alexandra's posture became visible. Her shoulders stiffened, her smile grew tight. And when the host casually asked Sandra about their old on-set chemistry, Alexandra's hand gripped the armrest of her chair. Then, like a spark landing on dry grass, it happened. "So," the host said with a teasing tone, "people online say Keanu and Sandra have this timeless connection. Some even wonder if you two were meant to end up together." The audience chuckled. Keanu tried to deflect with humor. "We've been friends for a long time. She's family to me," he said warmly. Sandra added gently, "We share a deep respect. It's rare in this industry," but Alexandra leaned forward, her voice suddenly sharp. "Maybe he should just go back to Sandra then," she said into the microphone. The room fell silent. The host's smile froze. For a second, time stopped. Keanu blinked, as if absorbing the weight of her words. The audience shifted uncomfortably. Sandra's eyes widened, not in anger, but in stunned disbelief. Alexandra had said it. On live television, the host tried to smooth things over with a laugh. "Well, that's quite a statement." But the damage was done. The cameras captured every expression. Sandra's composed shock, Keanu's quiet hurt, and Alexandra's defiant tilt of the chin. What Alexandra didn't realize was that this moment, this unfiltered jab, would set in motion a sequence of events that neither she nor the audience could ever forget. As the segment ended, a break was announced. Behind the scenes, producers whispered urgently, unsure how to handle what had just aired. Keanu walked toward a quiet corner, his usually composed demeanor clouded by something deeper. He wasn't angry in the loud, explosive way most people would expect. His pain was quieter, steadier, the kind that builds pressure slowly. Sandra approached him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded. Though his eyes revealed a storm forming beneath the surface, Alexandra stood alone, realizing the gravity of what she had said. But pride kept her rooted in place. In her mind, she had only voiced what others hinted at. She didn't understand yet that kindness, once crossed, often returns in unexpected forms. And when they returned to the stage after the break, Keanu Reeves would not be the same. The air in the studio was different after the break. It wasn't the usual nervous anticipation of live television. It was heavier, like the charged silence before a summer storm breaks open. Stagehands moved swiftly, adjusting microphones and camera angles, their chatter unusually subdued. The producers whispered in corners, trying to predict how the second half of the show would unfold. The audience, once buzzing with light-hearted excitement, now sat with a kind of curious tension, their eyes flitting between the stage and the glowing red on-air sign that would flick back to life in seconds. Somewhere in the middle of it all, Keanu Reeves stood near the curtains, silent and still, his hands loosely clasped in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but those who knew him well would have recognized the quiet intensity building behind his calm exterior. Keanu wasn't a man of loud outbursts. When he hurt, he retreated inward first, gathering thoughts, emotions, and truths like stones being carefully arranged in a riverbed. And tonight, that river was about to flow. Sandra Bullock stepped closer, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "You don't have to respond to that," she whispered gently. "People will understand." Everyone saw what happened. She wasn't trying to protect his image. She was trying to protect his heart. She had seen his face in that split second after Alexandra's remark, the flicker of disbelief, then the quiet ache. It was the kind of hurt that came not from strangers, but from someone who should have known better. Keanu turned to her slowly, his gaze thoughtful. "I know," he said in his soft, measured tone. "But sometimes silence lets things grow in the wrong direction." He looked toward the stage, where Alexandra stood talking to a producer, her arms crossed defensively. "This isn't about winning a fight," he added. "It's about setting something straight for everyone." There was no bitterness in his voice. There was resolve. When the red light blinked on again and the cameras resumed, the host welcomed everyone back with a forced smile, trying to restore the earlier energy. "We're back with Keanu Reeves, Sandra Bullock, and Alexandra Grant," he announced, his voice a shade too bright. Before the break, things got interesting. A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, more nervous than amused. Alexandra sat with her chin slightly lifted, trying to project composure, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Keanu and Sandra sat beside her, composed but focused. The host began with a light question about their upcoming projects, attempting to shift the mood. Sandra answered gracefully, giving thoughtful responses, but everyone in the room could sense that something was hanging in the air, unsaid. It was like an unfinished sentence, hovering just behind every camera lens. Keanu remained quiet for a while, listening carefully. He wasn't going to rush. He wasn't going to let emotion lead him blindly. Instead, he waited for the perfect moment, not to attack, but to speak truth. It came when the host turned to Keanu with a reflective tone. "Keanu," he said, "you've always been someone who values kindness and respect in your work and personal life. How do you handle moments when those values are tested? Publicly?" It was a delicate question, clearly designed to address what had happened earlier without naming it outright. The audience leaned in. Even Alexandra's fingers tightened slightly on her lap. Sandra glanced sideways at him, knowing that this was the door he had been waiting for. Keanu took a breath, leaned forward slightly, and spoke into the microphone with quiet strength. "Life has a way of putting us in unexpected situations," he began. "Sometimes those situations happen in private, and sometimes, like tonight, they happen under bright lights with cameras rolling. What matters isn't whether people are watching. What matters is whether we stay true to who we are." His voice was calm, but it carried a weight that filled the room. "I've learned that dignity isn't about staying silent to avoid discomfort. It's about speaking honestly, but with kindness, even when it's hard." Alexandra shifted slightly in her chair. The cameras caught the subtle movement, and a collective breath passed through the studio. Keanu turned slightly toward her, not in confrontation, but in acknowledgement. Earlier, something was said that hurt, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they represented. It's easy to joke about relationships, especially when people see connections on screen. Sandra and I have a friendship that's lasted for decades. It's built on trust, respect, and shared experiences. That kind of bond doesn't need to prove itself, and it shouldn't have to defend itself either. His eyes softened as he glanced at Sandra, whose expression was steady but touched. He then turned back toward the audience. "We live in a time where people love to choose sides, to pit one person against another. But the truth is, kindness doesn't belong to one relationship. Respect isn't a competition. Love in all its forms, friendship, romance, family, is about lifting each other up, not tearing each other down." His words were measured, but they struck with the quiet force of something deeply lived. The audience grew still. Even the host looked momentarily disarmed by the sincerity radiating from him. Alexandra opened her mouth slightly, as if to interject, but she stopped herself. The live audience was watching. Millions at home were watching, and Keanu wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't humiliating her. He was holding up a mirror, not just to her, but to the entire culture of quick judgments and careless remarks that often dominated public spaces. Sandra spoke softly then, adding warmth to his clarity. "I think what's beautiful about real friendships," she said, "is that they don't need to explain themselves. They just are. And sometimes, when the world talks too loudly, we forget to simply trust the people who've always been there." Her words acted like a gentle cushion beneath Keanu's firm truth, turning the moment from confrontation into reflection. The host, sensing the significance of the moment, leaned back and let the conversation breathe. There were no quick jokes this time, just silence, honest and raw as the weight of Keanu's words settled in. Some audience members nodded slowly. Others looked at Alexandra, whose confident exterior was beginning to show cracks. She wasn't used to this kind of response, one that didn't attack but also didn't bend. Keanu's approach left no room for playing the victim. It invited reflection instead. As the segment continued, Keanu shared a brief story about his early days in the industry when a mentor had told him, "In this world, storms will always come, but you decide whether to be the tree that bends or the one that breaks." He explained how he had carried those words through every challenge, personal and professional. Tonight, he concluded, I choose not to break. I choose to bend toward honesty, not away from it. The audience erupted into applause, not the usual polite clapping, but something deeper, a response born from witnessing authenticity in real time. Sandra reached over and squeezed his hand subtly, proud of how he had handled the moment. Alexandra sat in silence, her thoughts a swirling mix of regret, pride, and confusion. She hadn't expected him to respond this way. She had expected either avoidance or an argument. Instead, he had dismantled the sting of her earlier insult with grace so powerful that it left her speechless. When the cameras cut to commercial again, the tension on stage had transformed. It wasn't entirely gone, but it had shifted shape. The audience had witnessed something raw and real. Keanu had chosen his moment, and he had spoken not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been blindsided in public and found the strength to respond with dignity instead of destruction. And this was only the beginning. Because outside the studio walls, the clip of his speech was already being clipped, shared, and spreading like wildfire across the internet. What started as a moment of insult was about to become a global conversation about respect, love, and emotional integrity. When the broadcast ended that night, the studio emptied in waves. First the audience trickled out, buzzing with whispers and half-finished sentences. Then the crew began dismantling lights and cables, their movements slower than usual, as if they too were processing the unexpected gravity of what had happened on stage. Outside the building, the night air was cool and sharp, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. The world seemed quiet, but beneath that quiet, something vast had already begun to stir. Within minutes of the show ending, social media platforms lit up like wildfire. Clips of Keanu's calm but piercing response spread across every corner of the internet. Hashtags trended globally, accompanied by comments from viewers who felt they had witnessed something rare. Not a scandal, but a moment of emotional truth. Inside the private lounge reserved for guests, Keanu sat on a leather couch with a cup of tea in his hands. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or checking reactions. He rarely did. He preferred silence after moments like these, not because he was avoiding the noise, but because he wanted to absorb everything honestly. Sandra was sitting across from him, her shoes kicked off, her legs folded up on the couch, like someone who had long stopped pretending to be anything other than herself around him. She studied his face carefully. "You know," she said quietly, "you didn't just handle that well. You changed the entire energy of the room." Keanu gave a faint, humble smile. "I didn't want to hurt her," he said, "but I couldn't let that moment pass." He looked down at the tea, watching the steam rise and swirl. Sometimes people say things out of fear, not malice. But that doesn't mean those words don't have weight. His voice carried no anger, only reflection. Sandra nodded slowly. She had known him for so many years, and this was what always set him apart. He never met cruelty with cruelty. Instead, he met it with honesty that made people confront themselves. Meanwhile, across the hallway, Alexandra sat alone in the dressing room. The bright mirror lights reflected her face with unforgiving clarity. She had taken off her jewelry, but her dress still shimmered faintly under the light, a silent reminder of the performance she had just given, one she hadn't planned to go this way. She had thought she was being bold, reclaiming space, but now, staring at her own reflection, she saw something else entirely. She saw the flash of defensiveness in her eyes, the tightness in her jaw, the split second when her pride had pushed words past the point of no return. And she remembered Keanu's response. Not loud, not cruel, but honest in a way that left her with nowhere to hide. Her phone vibrated repeatedly on the counter. At first, she ignored it. Then she picked it up and scrolled. Messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers filled the screen. Some were supportive, telling her to stand her ground. Others were sharply critical. "That was low," one comment read. "Why try to humiliate someone like that?" said another. But what struck her most wasn't the criticism. It was the overwhelming wave of praise directed toward Keanu. People weren't laughing at the drama. They were deeply moved by the way he had handled it. Headlines appeared on entertainment blogs within the hour. Keanu's graceful live TV response wins hearts. When dignity speaks louder than drama, Sandra and Keanu show how real bonds endure. For the first time that night, Alexandra felt something heavy settle in her chest. Not anger, not even jealousy. It was something quieter and more piercing, regret. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes. She had spent years building a public image of strength and artistry, of independence and intellectualism. But in one careless moment, driven by insecurity she hadn't wanted to admit, she had fractured that image. More painfully, she had fractured something between her and Keanu, something that couldn't be fixed with a press statement or an apology typed out by a publicist. The door to the dressing room opened gently, and Keanu stepped in. He didn't knock loudly. He never did. Alexandra opened her eyes, startled, but also strangely relieved to see him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, but not violent, more like the silence after an argument between two people who once understood each other deeply. He stood near the doorway, hands in his pockets, his expression calm but serious. "You didn't have to come," she said quietly, trying to regain some of her usual poise. "I know," he replied simply, "but I wanted to." He walked in slowly, stopping a few feet away from her. "We should talk. Not as headlines, not as clips. Just us." She looked away, suddenly finding it difficult to meet his gaze. "I made a fool of myself, didn't I?" Keanu shook his head gently. "You made a mistake," he said. "We all do. But what matters is what we do after." His voice carried the same quiet firmness it had on stage. "You know me, Alexandra. I don't respond to humiliation with retaliation. But you need to understand something. What you said wasn't just a joke that went wrong. It cut deep, not because of the words themselves, but because they came from you." Alexandra felt her throat tighten. She had expected him to be distant or cold, but the steadiness in his tone was harder to face. "I was angry," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Not at you. Not really. At everything. At the way people look at you and Sandra. At the way they talk about her as if I don't exist. At how small I felt in that moment." She finally met his eyes. "And instead of dealing with that, I threw it at you." Keanu listened without interrupting, his expression softening. "I get it," he said. "But you don't have to compete with anyone, Alexandra. Not with Sandra. Not with anyone. The world might create stories, but we get to choose which ones we believe." He took a small step closer. "I've always respected your strength. But tonight, it felt like you were trying to prove something you didn't need to prove. And that hurt, not just for me, but for you too." Tears welled up in her eyes, surprising even herself. Alexandra wasn't someone who cried easily, especially not in front of him. But something about his calm truth stripped away the layers she usually hid behind. "I didn't expect you to say it like that," she whispered. "I know," he said softly. "That's why I did." The conversation lingered in that quiet space where real understanding begins, not with grand gestures, but with honesty neither side expected. Keanu didn't forgive her on the spot. He didn't offer easy absolution, but he gave her something rarer, a mirror she could face without shame if she chose to. Later that night, as Keanu left the studio with Sandra by his side, paparazzi cameras flashed from across the street. Reporters shouted questions about Alexandra's comment, about his response, about his relationship with Sandra. He didn't answer any of them. He didn't need to. His actions and words on stage had already spoken louder than any headline could. Sandra walked beside him quietly, their steps in sync, the bond between them unshaken by public noise. Back inside, Alexandra sat alone once more, watching clips of the interview replay on her phone. This time she didn't focus on herself. She watched his face as he spoke to the audience, the steadiness, the kindness, the quiet power. For the first time, she truly saw how the world saw him, not through the lens of envy or insecurity, but through genuine awe. And in that realization, something within her began to shift. It wasn't immediate redemption. It wasn't some cinematic epiphany. But it was the beginning of understanding that the storm she created had revealed more about herself than anyone else. And as the night deepened, Alexandra understood that the echo of her words would follow her beyond the stage, not as a curse, but as a lesson she couldn't ignore. By the following morning, the sun had barely risen over Los Angeles when the interview clip exploded beyond anything the network had anticipated. Overnight, what began as a tense, awkward moment on live television had transformed into a cultural conversation. Talk shows replayed the scene on loop, dissecting every facial expression, every pause between words. Commentators analyzed Keanu's response like it was a speech in a courtroom, pointing out the precision of his calm and the way his words resonated beyond celebrity drama. Social media became a living organism of its own, pumping out reactions by the second. The hashtags had climbed to the top of global trends. Just Keanu speaks, Grace under pressure, Sandra and Keanu, and even lessons from Keanu flooded timelines. People weren't just talking about the insult anymore. They were talking about the way he had transformed it. Across the world, clips were shared with captions like, "This is how you handle disrespect with dignity," and "Real strength is quiet." On morning news segments in Europe and Asia, anchors introduced the clip not as entertainment gossip, but as an example of emotional intelligence and composure in the face of public provocation. Teachers played the segment in classrooms during media lessons, highlighting how public figures could model maturity instead of feeding controversy. Even unexpected voices joined the chorus: mental health advocates, motivational speakers, relationship counselors, all praising the way Keanu navigated an emotional minefield without humiliating anyone. Meanwhile, Alexandra Grant woke up to a very different world. Her phone was flooded with notifications that refused to be ignored. Overnight, her name had been mentioned in millions of posts. Some defended her, painting her as a woman pushed to the edge by media narratives about Sandra and Keanu. But a far larger portion criticized her for lashing out in public. She scrolled through comments with trembling hands, the brightness of the screen stabbing at her tired eyes. This was beneath her, one commenter wrote. "I admired her before, but this wasn't it." Another said, "We all get insecure, but you don't take it out on people who care about you." The harshest comments weren't filled with rage. They were filled with disappointment, and that cut deeper than anger ever could. She avoided calls from her publicist at first. She didn't want to hear the inevitable instructions about drafting a statement or damage control. She wasn't ready to be polished into something palatable for headlines. Instead, she sat by the window watching the city wake up slowly. Cars moved through early morning fog like small, determined creatures. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed faintly. The world kept moving, indifferent to personal turmoil. For the first time in years, Alexandra felt small, not in the way that insecurity had whispered to her before, but in the way a person feels when they realize they can't control how truth unfolds once it's out in the world. Keanu, meanwhile, started his morning with his usual quiet routine. He made coffee in his kitchen, fed his dog, and sat by the window reading. Unlike most celebrities, he didn't live with an entourage or a swarm of assistants. His house was quiet, his mornings sacred, but even in that silence, he could feel the shift outside. His agent called to inform him that multiple media outlets were requesting interviews to discuss his powerful moment. He politely declined. "It wasn't a performance," he said simply. "It was just me speaking." His refusal to exploit the moment only amplified the respect people had for him. Fans online contrasted his quiet with Alexandra's swirling digital storm, and the difference became a story of its own. Sandra Bullock, too, found herself unexpectedly at the center of the storm. She had gone home after the interview with a mixture of admiration and concern. She knew how moments like this could spin out of control. She had seen it countless times in her career, but as she sat on her porch drinking tea the next morning, She opened her phone and saw messages from people all over the world saying how much they admired the way she and Keanu had supported each other without adding fuel to the fire. She smiled softly. Over the years, they had shared countless moments, funny, dramatic, painful, but this one was different. It wasn't about a film or a joke on a talk show. It was about something real being revealed on a global stage. By midday, talk show hosts invited psychologists to analyze why Keanu's response resonated so deeply. When explained, people are starved for examples of dignity in public life. They're used to explosive feuds, social media wars, and carefully curated apologies. What they saw here was someone acknowledging hurt without turning it into spectacle. It reminded people that kindness isn't weakness, it's strength under control. The clip reached tens of millions of views. Reaction videos flooded YouTube. Couples discussed it over breakfast. Teachers shared it in staff meetings. Something about that moment had cracked through the usual noise. Alexandra couldn't escape it. Her publicist finally cornered her on a video call, urging her to issue a statement. "We need to respond before the narrative solidifies," he insisted. But Alexandra sat there, her hair pulled back, no makeup, her expression tired. "I don't want to issue something that sounds fake," she said quietly. "I don't want to say what people expect. I need to figure out what I actually feel." It was the first honest thing she had said in days, and her publicist, sensing the gravity of her tone, softened. "Then take a day," he said. "But understand, the world is already deciding for you." Later that afternoon, Alexandra ventured out quietly, wearing sunglasses and a hoodie to avoid attention. But she couldn't hide from the billboards displaying the network's rerun schedules, plastered with images from the interview. In a cafe, she overheard strangers talking about it. "That guy handled it like a pro," one woman said. "He didn't humiliate her." That's rare. Alexandra felt a sting, not from malice, but from truth reflected back to her through strangers' voices. Meanwhile, Keanu spent the afternoon visiting a children's hospital, something he often did without media coverage. He read books to kids, signed toys, and listened to their stories with genuine attention. For him, it wasn't about optics. It was about staying grounded in what mattered. He had always believed that real strength wasn't proven in interviews, but in quiet, consistent acts of kindness. One of the nurses showed him the trending clip on her phone and told him, "You have no idea how much that moment meant to people." He smiled, a little embarrassed, and simply said, "I just spoke from the heart." As evening fell, Alexandra found herself standing alone on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker. She thought about the woman she had been the night before, defensive, sharp, determined to control a narrative that was never hers to control. And then she thought about Keanu's face as he spoke, the way he had looked at her, not with contempt but with disappointment wrapped in care. The world was watching, but beneath all that noise, the real reckoning wasn't external. It was within her. She had to decide whether she would retreat into pride and let the world's perception harden around her mistake, or whether she would face the mirror honestly, even if it hurt. And for the first time in a long time, Alexandra felt something crack open, not in defeat, but in the quiet, fragile way that truth often breaks through pride. The world was watching, but what mattered now was what she would do next when no one was looking. The next 48 hours unfolded like a slow tidal wave for Alexandra. At first, she tried to convince herself that the intensity of the public's reaction would fade quickly, like most online controversies do. She told herself that the world was fickle, that in a few days another headline would replace hers, another scandal would consume the public's attention. But as the hours passed, she realized this was different. What people had witnessed on that stage wasn't a fleeting moment of drama. It was a collision between raw human insecurity and a response that transcended celebrity gossip. The way Keanu had handled the situation had turned the incident into something far bigger than her. It had become a mirror for millions of people watching. Alone in her apartment, Alexandra found herself pacing through her studio, surrounded by her unfinished paintings. Canvases leaned against the walls like silent witnesses, each brushstroke capturing fragments of thoughts she once felt but never spoke aloud. Her art had always been her safe place, the one realm where she could express vulnerability without judgment. But now, even here, she felt the presence of that moment. Her mind kept replaying the split second when she leaned into the microphone and let those bitter words slip. Maybe he should just go back to Sandra. It wasn't the sentence itself that haunted her. It was what lay beneath it, the insecurity she hadn't wanted to acknowledge, the fear of being overshadowed by someone she'd convinced herself was a threat. In truth, Sandra had never been her enemy. The real struggle had always been within. As the morning light filtered through the large windows, Alexandra finally sat down in front of a blank canvas. She picked up a brush but didn't move it. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy white surface, a reminder that the hardest thing to paint isn't what's outside, it's what's inside. She set the brush down and picked up her phone. Dozens of missed calls from her publicist, journalists, and friends appeared on the screen. At the bottom of the list, one message caught her attention. It wasn't a statement or an offer. It was a short text from Sandra Bullock. "If you ever want to talk, not for the cameras, just human to human, I'm here." Alexandra stared at the message for a long time, her chest tightening. Sandra's grace had always unsettled her, not because Sandra tried to be perfect, but because she didn't have to. She was effortlessly warm, the kind of person whose kindness disarmed people. Alexandra had spent years building a protective wall of intellect and composure, but Sandra had always managed to stand outside it without even trying. And now, when Alexandra expected judgment or silence, Sandra had extended an open hand instead. She didn't reply right away. She wasn't ready. But something in that simple message began to chip away at the defenses she had spent years building. For the first time since the incident, Alexandra considered the possibility that her redemption wouldn't come through carefully worded press releases or grand gestures, but through quiet, honest conversations, the kind she had avoided for too long. Meanwhile, Keanu's life moved forward in its characteristic steady rhythm, even as the world continued to dissect his every word from that night. He avoided interviews, choosing instead to stay focused on his work and his quiet acts of kindness. When asked by a journalist outside a studio if he had forgiven Alexandra, he simply replied, "This isn't about forgiveness as a headline. It's about understanding as people." The simplicity of that statement became another viral moment. Commentators noted how he refused to turn the situation into a battle of narratives. He didn't play the victim, nor did he play the hero. He simply remained human, and in a culture addicted to spectacle, that sincerity was magnetic. Public sentiment toward Alexandra continued to shift in subtle ways. The initial wave of criticism had been sharp, but now a quieter conversation emerged online. Some people began discussing the deeper layers of insecurity that had fueled her remark. Mental health advocates highlighted how public pressure, comparison, and unspoken fears can push people to lash out in ways that don't reflect their true selves. "We've all had moments where insecurity speaks before our hearts do," one viral post read. "The question is, what do we do after?" That post alone received millions of likes and shares, turning the incident into something resembling a collective self-reflection. Alexandra saw that post one evening, lying on her couch in the dark. She read the comments where strangers shared their own stories of saying something they regretted, of losing themselves in fear, of finding ways to make amends. For the first time, she didn't feel attacked. She felt seen. The following day, she made a decision. Not a public one, not yet. A private one. She called her publicist and told him she wanted to record a message, not a scripted apology, but something honest. "No teleprompters," she said. "No edits that make it sound like a press conference. Just me." Her publicist hesitated, worried about the risks of unscripted emotion. But she insisted. She knew that if she tried to package her feelings, the world would see through it. What people had responded to in Keanu wasn't perfection. It was authenticity. If she wanted to move forward, she had to face that same mirror. Later that evening, she set up a small camera in her studio. She didn't wear makeup. She didn't have anyone else in the room. She sat in front of her paintings, with a single lamp casting soft light across her face. And then, after a long breath, she pressed record. "I've been quiet because I didn't know what to say," she began. Her voice was steady but vulnerable. "The truth is, what I said that night wasn't fair to Keanu, to Sandra, or to myself. It came from a place of insecurity that I wasn't ready to admit. But watching the world's reaction, and more importantly, watching his response, made me confront something I've avoided for a long time, my own fear of being overshadowed. Sandra has never done anything to hurt me. Keanu has never belittled me. The storm wasn't them, it was inside me, and I let it speak through me in the worst way possible." She paused, her eyes glistening. "I don't expect instant forgiveness. I just want to take responsibility for what was mine and start becoming a better version of myself." When she finished recording, she didn't send the video out immediately. She watched it twice, both times with her heart pounding. It wasn't perfect. Her voice cracked in places. She stumbled over a few words. But it was real. She sent it to her publicist with a single instruction: post it as it is. And then she turned off her phone and went for a long walk under the evening sky, unsure of how the world would react, but strangely relieved that, for the first time since the incident, she had spoken not as Alexandra, the public figure, but as Alexandra, the human being. The video spread quickly once it was posted. People were surprised by its rawness. There were no dramatic soundtracks, no defensive justifications, no rehearsed lines. It was simply a woman owning her mistake with sincerity. The response was unexpectedly empathetic. Many praised her courage for addressing the root of her behavior rather than hiding behind excuses. Others said the video reminded them that even those who seem strong can wrestle with fears they don't show. The narrative began to shift, not away from accountability, but toward redemption. Keanu saw the video late that night. He watched it alone, without commentary, just as he had done after the interview. When it ended, he sat quietly for a long moment. He wasn't interested in whether people would accept her apology. What mattered to him was whether it came from a real place. And he could see that it did. A small, thoughtful smile appeared on his face, not of triumph, but of quiet respect, and somewhere between regret and acceptance, between shame and courage, Alexandra Grant took her first real step forward, not because the world demanded it, but because her heart finally did. The weeks that followed Alexandra's heartfelt video were unlike anything she had experienced in her career. The storm that had once threatened to swallow her slowly began to settle into something calmer, almost reflective. Public reaction was not unanimously forgiving. Some remained skeptical, others harsh, but there was a noticeable shift. People weren't talking about the incident with mockery anymore. They were discussing it like a moment of collective learning. Her video had sparked conversations about insecurity, jealousy, pride, and the power of vulnerability. In podcasts and talk shows, experts referred to her response as an example of emerging from public error with authenticity. It wasn't a story of instant redemption. It was one of slow, deliberate growth. And in that honesty, people found something to respect again. Alexandra herself underwent a quiet transformation. She didn't rush to reclaim the spotlight. She withdrew from events, interviews, and public appearances, not out of shame, but out of a genuine need to understand herself away from the noise. Her days were spent in her studio, painting with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. Her new works were different, less controlled, more emotional. Splashes of bold color mingled with deliberate imperfections, each canvas reflecting not the image she wanted the world to see, but the truth she had hidden from herself for so long. For the first time in a long time, her art wasn't a shield. It was a confession. She also reached out to Sandra privately. The text exchange that followed was honest and gentle. Sandra, in her characteristic way, didn't dwell on the insult. She spoke about how life has a way of pushing people to their edges, and how what matters is who they choose to become after. They met for coffee one quiet afternoon, away from cameras, at a small cafe tucked between old buildings. The conversation wasn't dramatic. It wasn't full of apologies or tears. It was real. Sandra spoke openly about her own insecurities over the years, about how the industry sometimes pits women against each other in subtle ways. Alexandra listened, truly listened, without the defensive walls that had once surrounded her. For the first time, she saw Sandra not as a symbol of what she feared losing, but as a person who understood the same human struggles she did. That day didn't erase what had happened, but it built something new, something fragile, yet genuine. Meanwhile, Keanu continued to live as he always had, quietly, deliberately, and without fanfare. But the world around him had changed. People saw him differently now. Not as just an actor, but as someone who embodied a kind of strength that the modern world often forgets to value. Invitations poured in for interviews, events, and motivational talks, but he declined most of them. He didn't want his moment of honesty to become a brand. When asked why he refused to capitalize on it, he simply said, "Truth isn't a performance. It's a way of living." His refusal only deepened the respect people had for him. Then came the day that would bring everything full circle. The same network that had hosted the now famous interview invited Keanu, Sandra, and Alexandra for a follow-up segment weeks later. Initially, Alexandra hesitated. She didn't want to relive the moment under glaring studio lights. But after days of reflection, she agreed. Not to defend herself, not to rewrite history, but to close the circle honestly. Sandra supported the idea, and Keanu, when approached, gave his quiet nod. "If we're doing it," he said, "let's do it with truth." The night of the broadcast arrived quietly. There were no teasers or sensational headlines leading up to it, just a simple announcement that the three of them would return for a special conversation about growth and understanding. The studio was packed, but the atmosphere was different this time. It wasn't the buzzing energy of anticipation for drama. It was a quiet curiosity, the kind that comes when people sense they are about to witness something meaningful. When the lights came on and the three of them walked onto the stage together, the audience erupted in applause, not the loud, frenzied kind that seeks spectacle, but a warm, collective welcome. Keanu wore his familiar black suit, understated as always. Sandra exuded her calm, radiant warmth. And Alexandra, dressed simply in muted tones, carried herself with a humility that was new, not forced, but earned. They sat down, the three of them side by side, the same arrangement as before, but the energy between them had changed completely. The host began by acknowledging the weight of the previous interview and the global reaction it had sparked. He asked Alexandra to share what the past weeks had been like. She took a deep breath and spoke slowly, her voice steady but sincere. "The hardest part wasn't the public reaction," she admitted. "It was facing myself without excuses. It's easy to blame others. It's harder to stand in front of a mirror and ask, why did I say what I said? What was I afraid of? I spent years trying to control how people saw me, and in one moment my fear spoke louder than my heart. But what surprised me wasn't just the criticism. It was the way people responded to honesty, Keanu's honesty, and eventually mine. I realized that growth doesn't happen when everything is polished. It happens in the cracks." Her words were not rehearsed. They flowed with the ease of someone who had lived through the fire and emerged with new clarity. Sandra then shared her perspective, speaking gently about the importance of empathy, especially among women in a world that often thrives on competition. "We're all carrying invisible stories," she said, "and sometimes the world tries to turn those stories into rivalries. But the real strength is in choosing understanding over division." Finally, the host turned to Keanu, asking him what the entire experience had meant to him. He paused for a long moment before answering, his gaze thoughtful. "I think what this showed all of us," he said, "is that kindness isn't passive, it's active. It doesn't mean letting hurtful things slide, it means choosing to respond in a way that doesn't multiply the hurt." That night I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was just trying to be honest. And I think if more of us responded to pain with clarity instead of fire, the world would be a little less noisy and a lot more human. The audience erupted into heartfelt applause. It wasn't about heroism or villains anymore. It was about the quiet power of humanity. The segment ended not with dramatic music or forced smiles, but with the three of them standing together, not as symbols of scandal, but as people who had walked through an uncomfortable truth and emerged stronger. In the days that followed, the follow-up interview spread across the world, not as a viral drama, but as a story of redemption, humility, and emotional strength. People cited it in classrooms, workplaces, and family conversations. It became less about celebrity and more about the universal human experience of making mistakes, facing them and growing beyond them. For Alexandra, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, not defined by insecurity, but by self-awareness. For Sandra, it reaffirmed the quiet strength of grace. And for Keanu, it simply reinforced what he had always known. The greatest power lies not in how loudly we speak, but in how truthfully we live. And in that shared moment beneath the studio lights, what had once been a public fracture became a living reminder that dignity, kindness, and courage can turn even the most painful moments into something beautiful.